Now, Labour is looking to introduce a points-based system which will reward prisoners for their good behaviour. The Justice Secretary will look at a Texas-style point system which offers offenders courses on reoffending, drugs or alcohol to reduce their sentences. And the news comes after 37 domestic abusers were wrongly released from prison yesterday under Labour's controversial prisoner release scheme following its action plan to reduce prison capacity. Well, I'm still joined in the studio here by my superstar panel. That's the Conservative MP for Romford, Andrew Rosendale, and, of course, Peter Tatchell, the human rights campaigner and activist. Gentlemen, thank you for your company as ever. Peter, I'm going to start with you. It may come as a surprise to you. I think this idea has merit. I've spent a lot of time in prisons, I hasten to say, for the right reasons. I go into prisons to talk to young men about what it means to be a man, to try and give them some insight to help to rehabilitate them. And I was always been struck by the idea that if you treat them with a bit of compassion, then you get something back. Give them a trade, they might have a chance on Civvy Street, whereas throwing them out, ill-prepared, often for a life of guaranteed homelessness, as we're seeing at the moment. That's why things are going so wrong. It's spectacularly failing. It might seem a bit touchy-feely, but do you think this kind of Texas-style point system has any merit?
We sort of already have it, because to get parole or to be released on licence, you have to have shown good behaviour. But I'd be all in favour of extending it. I'd even go further, though. I think all prisoners should be encouraged to work, to do productive labour, to produce economic wealth, and in return, as doing that, they should also get remission in their sentences together with their good behaviour. I have been to HMP Grendon, which is a model prison. It's the gold standard for prisons in the UK.
Yep.
It is all about rehabilitation. The prisoners actually run the prison, their own sections themselves. They have weekly counselling and psychological sessions.
What kind of offenders always? They're not like killers.
Yes, murderers, child molesters, the worst of the worst.
They're running the nicks.
Yeah. They're running their own little unit. Yeah.
Wow.
But it's all about self-responsibility, teaching them to take charge of their own lives, their own future, and chart a positive outcome. Now, the results are that HMP Grendon, the reoffending rate is half the national average. It's a huge success story, and it shows that rehabilitation works. And I just think that every prison in this country, of course, people need to be punished. There needs to be deterrence, but we need to give people the chance of rehabilitation and to acquire the skills they need so that when they're released, they can get jobs and be productive members of society.
Andrew Rosendale, Peter Tatchell's saying a lot of things there which no doubt would challenge your notion of law and order, as someone from the Conservative right, being compassionate towards paedophiles, compassionate towards killers, might go get the instinct of a lot of our viewers. But is punishment just about retribution? Is it about punishment? Or is there some merit in a bit of humanity, equipping them to be better citizens if they're ever released?
Look, no one can disagree with the importance of rehabilitation and ensuring that when a prisoner goes into prison, that they leave prison perhaps as a better person, better equipped to go back into society and not to reoffend. So anything that can do what's happening at HMP Grendon, as Peter has outlined, that sounds excellent to me. However, punishment has to be there as well. You cannot just turn prisons into centres that people can go in and be given, lead a normal life in prison and then to go out, because then you're not discouraging people from committing those crimes. There's no deterrence. And I think that when it comes to sentencing, I've always tended to feel that we should have honest sentencing. Rather than actually let people out early, we should say, well, if you actually behave properly in prison and don't do bad things, then perhaps you'll go out when you're meant to leave rather than have it extended.
But isn't part
That's a better way of doing it.
But isn't part of the problem, though, is that successive governments, again, Conservatives, 14 years in power, and the Labour Party before that, haven't built enough nicks.
Well, that's all true.
So we're having to release people early because there's nowhere to store them.
We're facing this problem now because governments haven't planned. They haven't actually built enough prisons. The government are releasing people early, which I have grave concerns over. Now, 37 people have been released that shouldn't have been released.
Isn't that because the Tories didn't have enough capacity?
I'm sure it was.
And Labour have inherited this mess.
All governments have allowed this to emerge as a serious problem, and we should have been building more prisons. If you don't build enough prisons, there can't be a deterrent because people are let out far too early than their sentence was given in the first place. So that has to change. And the last government did make mistakes on this, but the idea that the solution is to just let loads of prisoners out early, as you could see the other week, prisoners uncorking champagne and saying, well, they're always going to vote Labour now because of it. This is not the way. There has to be punishment. There has to be deterrent.
Peter, but there's got to be rehabilitation, because if they just go into prison and come out the unreformed characters they went in, society isn't the benefit. We lose. Rehabilitation works well in a small minority of prisons, but it's a very tiny minority. I've dealt with prisoners who have been desperate to learn skills, even to learn English language if they're foreign nationals, so they can be productive members of society.
They were better off to be deported back to their own country.
They couldn't get the classes that they wanted. And so, if someone wants to get training and skills and they're not able to get it, like some of them are very poorly educated and they want to get their O-levels, A-levels, GCSEs and all the old qualifications.
Quick point though, Peter.
They can't.
Quick point though. A lot of these cons are going to see this, all I've got to do is go to a little drug rehabilitation course, tick a few boxes, sit in the corner, pretend like I'm bored, and I'll be out early. Thank you very much. They could game the system.
No, the system has to be, there's proof with results. And it has to be not just ticking boxes and prisoners saying so. The other thing we have to remember is that about 2/3 of all prisoners have mental, drug and alcohol problems. And unless we deal with those, they're going to be in a cycle of prison, release, prison, release.
But even so, you don't want to make it an attractive option for people to commit crime and go to prison.
No, we're not.
And people actually to want to go there. No. You have to make it a punishment as well. Yes, rehabilitate, but also make sure that people know that they're not going to enjoy the experience of going to prison. Otherwise, it defeats the whole object.
And it's worth pointing out that 20% of the cons that have been released recently by the Labour Party are already back behind bars. Maybe a lot of them want to be back there. Maybe they get 3 meals a day. Maybe they're kept nice and warm. Maybe they miss their mates, and maybe that's a problem. We have institutional dependence.
Put them to work. Prisoners should help pay for the cost of their imprisonment. It shouldn't be the taxpayer. That's why I'm saying prisoners in prisons should do productive work that earns money for the exchequer. They get a small share of it. And if they're doing their job well, it also counts towards good behaviour for potential early release.
Peter, Andrew, superb stuff. You're getting on far too well. Let's have an argument after the break. Now, a story which the man who usually presents this show feels very, very strongly about. Counter-terrorism experts have warned that the threats to MPs on the basis of their views on the war in Gaza is soaring. And police have said that the spreading conflict, which is intensifying, of course, in Lebanon, could become a motivating factor for terror attacks and plots. Police pointed to the Hartlepool terror attack last year where jihadist Ahmed Ali murdered 70-year-old grandfather Terence Carney and told police it was revenge for Israel killing innocent people and children in airstrikes on Gaza. Now, this following, of course, the attacks on MP Sir David Amess. In fact, he was murdered just 2 years before when he was stabbed to death by an ISIS supporter. Now, we've got a quick clip here to show, because there is actually, at present, a protest going on right outside the studio here at Whitehall around the Lebanon protest. I think we've got some footage of that now we can show. So this is as we speak now outside. So there's a sizable protest again. And I've got to say, I walk through these things almost weekly. They've been going on now all the way through since October 7th. I've had stuff thrown at me. I've had eggs thrown at me. I tried to get the police. I begged the police to take down that projector, putting its disgusting image onto the Houses of Parliament there, onto Big Ben. But enough about me. Joining me now is my panel. And it's the Conservative MP for Romford, Andrew Rosendale, and Peter Tatchell, of course, the human rights campaigner and activist. Back to the point in question. I'll start with you, Andrew. The threat to MPs is clearly growing. Now, we've seen David Amess murdered, Mike Freer, of course, Finchley, MP, his arson attack on his office at the last general election. He stood down as a candidate. Labour Party MPs have had it too. Vicky Foxcroft, Lewisham North. Sir Keir Starmer was harangued off a train in Glasgow. Rachel Reeves on the general election campaign. Apolitically, it seems to be a growing phenomenon, and the people perpetrating this seem to be the new intolerant pro-Palestine protesters. Is this a growing threat?
So it's 3 years since Sir David was murdered, and we still live with the horror of that moment. All of us that get elected are always potentially under threat from someone. We all have people in our constituencies who blame us for everything and come to our surgeries or come to our offices and say and do things which are completely inappropriate and sometimes threatening. But what happened to David and Joe Cox before him was absolutely horrific. I fear, however, that not enough is done to protect parliamentarians, but also the anger in society, a lot of it misplaced, I have to say, seems to generate hatred towards elected politicians. There's no easy answer to this, but I do believe that the authorities in this country need to take it much more seriously, how elected politicians and public figures generally are not protected and are not safe from carrying out their elected duties.
Peter Tatchell, it cannot be ignored that this menace, this growing menace, has definitely increased since October the 7th. There seems to be a huge intolerance among the pro-Palestine protesters. It's a cause I know you sympathise with. I'm hoping you're going to call out this mob now and say, just calm down, lads.
Well, first let me say, when I stood for Parliament in Bermondsey in 1983, in the run-up to that election, I was violently assaulted 151 times.
Oh, that's disgusting.
And I had 2 attempts to run me down in cars. I had a bullet through the front door, arson attacks upon my flat as well. So I know firsthand the terror that many MPs are feeling. I totally agree that people have a right to protest, but not to the point of violence and threats and aggravated harassment. There has to be a legitimate challenge, that's part of politics, but not the extreme kind of behaviour of a minority. And it is a very small minority. Most of the people on the Palestine protests and other protests are well behaved. They are respectful of their critics and their opponents, but they're making a point. That's valid in a democracy. OK,
Peter Tatchell, excellent. I'd like to bring at this point a fitting moment to bring in Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg. Of course, State of the Nation is next. I know this is something that's impacted you. I've seen you harangue through the streets. The mob even visited your home and harassed your children. What's your take? Do you think it's the growing menace?
Well, I agree so much with Peter that people have a right to protest. Even outside my home, they have a right to protest as long as it's peaceful. I don't want them to. It's not nice to have people outside your house shouting at you, but as long as they're peaceful, it is legal, and so it should be. And there have always been risks. I think, again, Peter reminds us, it wasn't always safe in the 80s. Think of Ian Gow, Erin Neve in the late 70s. There has been a long-standing risk to public figures, and it's really, really important that we remain an open democratic society where our voters can come and talk to us. We mustn't all be hidden away.